Hi everyone. So we've just finished our unit on short fiction, and then we did a unit on drama, and now we are moving on to poetry. I have a different size presentation, so I hope this comes out okay. If it doesn't, follow along as best you can. The PowerPoint will also be in your Blackboard. One of the things too I want to say is that because some of the other lectures were longer, the ones I recorded earlier, one on doubt and one on Pygmalion and one on the literary terms for the short fiction, because those were so long, I'm trying to break up the presentations for you so you don't have to keep going back to YouTube and figuring out where you left off or sitting for 45 minutes. So for this presentation, since there are a lot of terms that I want you to know, I kind of broke it up into pieces. So this will be probably 2 or 3, possibly even 4 shorter lectures. So let's get started with our definition. Poetry is... I love this by poet Mina Loy. Poetry is prose bewitched, a music made of visual thoughts, the sound of an idea. Prose is the word that we use for non-poetic writing, so short stories, books, etc. Sometimes we'll even use that for nonfiction writing, like journalism. That's prose, right? It's arranged by sentences and paragraphs. Poetry is a literature that expresses ideas, feelings, or tells a story. The keys here are that there is, I'll get my pen out here, concentrated language. That's really the key. Using imagery, symbolism, meaning, just like fiction does, but a few other elements that are sort of unique just to poetry. Some things with the sound and the rhythm, the number of metaphors and similes, repetition and structure, and that kind of thing. So we'll be talking about all of those throughout these presentations. Oh, and words are broken up into lines and stanzas, which we'll look at in a moment. So again, prose versus poetry. Prose doesn't really pay attention to rhyme and rhythm, at least not usually. Sometimes you'll have more poetic prose, but then the writer is really trying to combine prose and poetry. Poetry pays a lot of attention to rhyme and rhythm. In prose, a lot of times there's no word limit. So if you have a short story, sometimes nowadays, if you try to publish a short story, it'll be under 1,000 words or under 5,000 words. But if you're telling a story, you can tell it as a 1,000-word piece of flash fiction, a 10,000-word short story, a novella, a novel, a series, right? There's no word limit, but poets use a limited number of words when they're writing poems. So there's a difference there as well. Every word means something in a poem. Sentences and paragraphs versus lines and stanzas. Language is more natural and grammatical in prose. Language is figurative and rhythmical in poetry. So grammar doesn't always matter. Places where there might be a period, maybe the poet put one in, maybe they left it out, just depending on how they felt that day. A lot of prose can be understood by reading it just once, but poems, a lot of times, you can read them more than once to understand the meaning. So says this chart. I think that there are stories we have read, and certainly the plays. I've read those plays multiple times. They're not prose, they're not poetry, they're drama. But I've read those plays multiple times, and to me, they mean something different every time I read them. I take something different out of them. And that's sort of the same with poetry as well. So poets have many tools that they use to add to the poem's sound, meaning, and having an emotional effect on the reader. One of the things I want to stress here is we're going to talk about some elements. Sometimes things like rhythm or meter means something and adds to the meaning of the poem. When I do a lecture on Goblin Market, which again is a little bit longer because I did it when I was recording sort of longer lectures. But when you watch the lecture on Goblin Market, I talk a lot about how the rhythm, the rhyme, how that means something, and also what effect it has on the reader. She's telling a story. So in places she speeds up, in other places she slows down. Same thing with the spoken word poetry. When you watch that lecture, I talk a lot about how some of the spoken word poets will speed up their rhythm when they're trying to kind of be funny or make describe a piece of imagery, and then they'll slow it down when they're really trying to make their words have an impact. But sometimes those don't have any impact on the meaning, and it's sort of like a song's melody. A song's melody doesn't really have to mean anything, right? Not all the time, anyway. So I'm going to skip over that. This poem I'm going to read to you, it's the poem that I used in this lecture to explain some of these literary elements. He uses a lot of the elements in this poem. So I thought that it would be good at least to have an example to sort of talk about some of these things. This is by Robert Frost, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now, if you've already listened to the lecture about how to read a poem, you will notice that the end punctuation does not occur on every line. So if you look at the first two lines, there's a period, a longer pause, a full stop. Then there's a semicolon. Semicolon is a moderate pause. So period, long pause, or full stop. Semicolon, moderate pause. After promises to keep, there's a comma, and that's just a brief pause. Same thing with the first sleep. Miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. But there's other lines that read fully like a sentence. So if you look at the second stanza, where lines are broken into stanzas, which we'll talk more about in a moment. If you look at the second stanza, that's all one sentence. And if it were printed out as prose, my little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. I'm reading it a little bit faster just so you can kind of get my point, because many times when people first read poems, they take a long pause or a full stop at the end of each line. And it helps with the meter, but it breaks up the meaning a little bit. So if I did that, my little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. You can hear when I do that, you hear the meter, but you don't get the meaning of the sentence. So it's just something to think about. Now let's talk about the other elements. Point of view in poetry. Unlike drama, where there's no point of view and just dialogue or monologues or soliloquies, we do have a point of view. The poet is the author of the poem. The speaker of the poem is a persona adopted by the poet. I want you to remember that term because it's going to be kind of important as we talk about who is saying what and what the point of view is. You can think of the speaker or the persona as kind of like a narrator in a short story or a novel. It's interesting to me, and I think this is because of how poetry is taught in middle school and high school. A lot of times poems or teachers teach poetry and they encourage students to use it as a form of getting their feelings out. So use strong language to express yourself. And that's not a bad thing. If you're a writer, that's not a bad place to start. And so, but because of that, people really think a lot of times that the poet is just expressing their feelings, and that all of the feelings described in the poem are personal to the poet. And that's really just not true. Once in a while, that's true in very specific forms of poetry. Confessional poetry, a lot of times that is the poet and the speaker are sort of the same. Similarly, in spoken word poetry, which we're going to look at later, the poet and the speaker might be close to each other, but there are still elements being used, and so therefore, in some way, there's a persona being put on. It's not just the person talking to you out of their own experience. And I never understand why people kind of struggle with this, because we don't question in a short story when there's a first person narrator. We don't say, well, that's the writer, that's the author who thinks those things. No, it's very clearly a character, and it's a character in poetry as well. A lot of times, sometimes the speaker and the poet can be alike and similar, and other times they have nothing to do with each other. Again, like an author and a narrator. I think of it, I have this picture of Jim Henson with Kermit the Frog. Kermit the Frog is similar to Jim Henson, right? But it's a character that Jim Henson is putting on to, or when he was alive, to express his beliefs in treating everyone kindly, having patience, that kind of thing. Similar to the speaker, but obviously not the same, a mouthpiece, if you will. So the use of persona in Stopping by the Woods. In plain sense, meaning if I ask just what's this poem about, right? Without getting into the symbolism and all that. In plain sense, this poem is told from the point of view of a man in the 1800s who is traveling by sleigh through the snowy woods. So they don't have cars, they have wagons, and in the wintertime, they slap some sleigh runners on those wagons so that they can go through the snow. And that's what's happening. He stops to consider the beauty around him. He thinks about staying longer, but he has promises or obligations that pull him back home. So there may be a deeper meaning to the poem, but we'll talk about that later. The important thing here is to realize this is not real. This is not something that happened to Robert Frost. He's taking on the persona of a man stopping in the woods, and he's thinking about what that man's experience would be like, contemplating the forest and contemplating his promises back home. The poet speaks to us using this man's voice. So he's using I, but again, that's a persona. The person isn't named, whoever this imaginary person is. But again, not the poet. Hopefully, that's a little bit more clear with this example. So poetry form, going beyond the speaker and looking at the form, the appearance of the words on the page. A line is the group of words together, is one line of the poem. A stanza is a group of lines arranged together. So here I have a different poem. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. This is a line. This is a stanza. These are called couplets because there are two lines in each stanza. This is from William Carlos Williams. He was an Imagist poet. Imagist poets tried to write poems that were sort of like snapshots in time, very much like haiku, which I'll also be talking about later. Another lecture that's a little bit longer. Sorry about that. But here we have an instant image. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. One sentence long, but broken up into 4 stanzas. Now, the thing is, a lot of people ask me what this poem means. And, to be honest, I don't know. It's sort of whatever you take out of it in a way. You could just say so much depends upon. Why? Because on a farm, a wheelbarrow was quite important. And perhaps that's something to do with it, but it really is more of this. It's not supposed to necessarily mean something, this poem. It's supposed to be creating a piece of artwork in your mind. And the word glazed, I love. Glazed with rainwater. So that's basically poetry form. There are many different types of forms. This one has a specific form. It's called a concrete poem. Here, the form of the poem creates a picture, and we have a swan on the water, and then the swan's reflection. Dusk, above the water hang loud flies, here oh so gray, then what, when, where? Or you could read it, what? A pale signal will appear. When? Soon before its shadow fades. Where? Here in this pool of opened eye. In us? No, upon us, as the very edges of where we take shape in the dark air. This object bears its image, awakening ripples of recognition that will brush darkness up into light. So this is an interesting poem because there aren't, you could break this, you could say that here comes a break in the stanzas and that we have one, maybe two here, right? Maybe three. You could also say that this is a one stanza poem, but basically, it's a concrete poem and you're not necessarily supposed to think as much about stanzas. It's interesting how the lines are broken up. And I like this poem quite a bit. It's got beautiful imagery in it. Types of stanzas. As I mentioned before, couplet, if you think of people who are in a couple, they're dating or they're married, it's two of them, hopefully. We have a 2-line stanza, triplet, just like when you have 3 babies, is a 3-line stanza. Quatrain, like quarter, is 4. Quintet, if you've known anybody who had quads or quints, quint means 5. Sestet or sextet is 6. Septet is 7, and octave is 8. Now, there are more after that, but for the most part in poetry, this is what we're kind of going to be looking at. And just sort of important to know the terminology. Again, a lot of times, like in the Imagist poem I just showed you, does it mean anything that it's broken into couplets? Not really. I mean, perhaps because there's a little bit of a shift in imagery at each point in those couplets, but the fact that it's 2 lines doesn't necessarily mean anything. It's just how the poet decided to structure his or her poem. But I'd still like you to know the terminology. So determining form. This poem has 4 stanzas, so 4 groupings of lines. Each one of those stanzas has 4 lines, and these are, again, known as quatrains. Does the form add anything to the message of the poem? Not necessarily. Sometimes it contributes to the message, but not always. Now, I will say this, a lot of ballads have a similar rhyme scheme to this, which we'll talk about in the next part of this lecture. And a lot of ballads are written in 4 with 4 lines, or with not necessarily 4 stanzas, but a lot of times they're broken up into 4 lines. This poem, though, isn't necessarily meant to be a ballad. It's not really completely in that form. Sorry to flip back and forth there. In a little bit, we'll talk about the rhythm, and then we'll talk more about types of poems, including ballads and a few other things, later on. So that will be the second part of the lecture, and I hope that you check into that. Thanks.